In 1937, an ocean liner was launched in Hamburg, a vessel meant to embody the dreams of the German people. The Wilhelm Gustloff was built to represent the prosperity of the Third Reich, a floating showcase of the regime's strength and its promise of care for ordinary citizens. The project was commissioned by Kraft durch Freude, Strength Through Joy, a subdivision of the German Labor Front, a massive state-controlled organization that united workers and employers. Tasked with organizing leisure activities aligned with Nazi ideals, Kraft durch Freude saw the liner as its crown jewel. The ship's construction was personally overseen by Robert Ley, one of the leading ideologues of Nazism and the head of the German Labor Front. Ranked fourth in the Nazi hierarchy, Ley was a staunch follower of Adolf Hitler and is even credited with inventing the infamous Heil Hitler salute. His mission was to generate broad popular support for the Nazi regime. The German Labor Front promoted workers' rights, opposed capitalism, liberalism, and revolution, and promised social welfare under National Socialism. As a result, working conditions in Germany improved, wages rose, and an extensive network of state-sponsored social programs, including vacation opportunities, took shape. Ley saw the liner as a symbol of a new society where the average worker could enjoy luxuries once reserved for the elite. Designed as a super comfortable cruise ship, it could accommodate 1,463 passengers and 415 crew members. The vessel displaced 25,500 tons, measured 208.5 meters in length and 23.5 meters in width. From keel to masthead, it stood 56 meters tall, a true giant of the seas, both in size and in design. There was no class division on board. All cabins offered equal levels of comfort, reinforcing the Nazi notion of unity and equality. Passengers enjoyed wooden furnishings, a 160-meter-long teak promenade deck, a swimming pool, a cinema, a library, gyms, sports courts, children's zones, and hobby clubs, all designed to create an atmosphere of accessible luxury. The ship embodied the slogan, "Strength Through Joy," offering working-class Germans a vacation experience that in other countries was reserved for the wealthy. A week-long cruise to Italy cost just 150 Reichsmarks, while the average German worker earned between 180 and 200. This level of affordability was revolutionary. In just a few years before the outbreak of war, over 60,000 German workers and their families had sailed aboard. The launching ceremony on May 5, 1937, was a major event. Among the guests were Wilhelm Gustloff's widow and Adolf Hitler himself, who used the occasion to stress the ship's safety and unsinkable nature. "The Third Reich needs no Titanics," the Führer declared, a bold assertion of Nazi confidence. The liner quickly earned the nickname Sun Ship, symbolizing the bright future promised by Nazi propaganda. It hosted notable figures, including Eva Braun, and in 1939 transported pilots of the Condor Legion home from Spain, where they had fought for Franco. Hamburg held a grand celebration upon their return, further cementing the ship's status as an icon of Nazi greatness. This period marked the height of the Wilhelm Gustloff's fame. It encapsulated the ideals of the Third Reich: prosperity, unity, and strength. But behind this glamorous facade lay vulnerabilities that would soon be exposed with the coming of war. The name Wilhelm Gustloff was born out of tragedy, symbolism, and Nazi propaganda. Initially, Robert Ley had planned to name the ship Adolf Hitler as a gift from German workers to their Führer, but Hitler, a deeply superstitious man, refused. He feared that naming a ship after himself might bring misfortune. What if it struck a reef or sank? A failure like that could forever tarnish his reputation. Similar concerns in 1939 led to the renaming of the heavy cruiser Deutschland to Lützow. History, however, would show that such precautions were futile. Both ships eventually met tragic ends. The liner was instead named after Wilhelm Gustloff, a Nazi official, assassinated in February 1936 in Davos, Switzerland, by David Frankfurter, a Jewish student. A trained financier, Gustloff had led the NSDAP's Swiss branch and was known for his anti-Semitic activities. Through his banking contacts, he helped finance Nazi operations abroad. Gustloff's assassination became a perfect tool for the Reich's propaganda machine. Germany declared a national day of mourning. Hitler, Goebbels, and other high-ranking officials attended the funeral. A memorial was built in Schwerin. Streets, factories, newspapers, and eventually the ship were named in his honor. The murder by a Jew was used to reinforce the narrative of a national threat, further inflaming anti-Semitic sentiment. Despite its symbolic value, the Wilhelm Gustloff suffered from technical shortcomings that made it vulnerable. Its engines produced 9,500 horsepower, enabling a modest speed of only 15.5 knots, significantly slower than many contemporary liners. In peacetime, this wasn't critical, but in wartime, such sluggishness could be fatal. Built for comfort, not for speed or agility, the ship was tailored to serve propaganda, not strategy. It cost 30 million Reichsmarks, an enormous sum invested in a symbol meant to demonstrate the superiority of the Nazi system. The propaganda apparatus of the Third Reich leveraged the ship to full effect. It was a floating billboard proving that the German worker could afford luxury, once the domain of Europe's elite. But the ideological dream proved fragile. As war loomed, it became clear that the golden days of the Sun ship were numbered, and that its symbolic greatness would be powerless in the face of combat reality. The next chapter of the liner's history would unfold in a completely different environment, one in which it would forever lose its civilian glory. With the outbreak of World War II, the Wilhelm Gustloff lost its status as a luxury cruise ship and entered a new, unfamiliar reality: military service. Just 3 days before Germany invaded Poland on August 29, 1939, the ship's captain received a classified order to return to Germany immediately. That marked the end of the ship's civilian career. Once used for pleasure cruises to Italy, the liner was transferred to the Kriegsmarine, the German Navy. Its peaceful mission was replaced by the demands of war. In September 1939, the Wilhelm Gustloff was converted into a hospital ship. It was painted white, and the Strength Through Joy emblem, a swastika in a sun disk, was replaced by a red cross on its single funnel. This status granted the ship protection under the Hague Convention, which prohibited attacks on hospital vessels. In its new role, the liner received wounded soldiers, including Polish troops. German propaganda used these images to promote the humanitarian side of the regime. Photos of Polish soldiers being cared for aboard the ship quickly appeared in newspapers, reinforcing the Third Reich's portrayal of itself as morally superior, even as it launched a war of aggression. By 1940, the ship's purpose changed again. After the failed German attempt to invade the British Isles, with the Luftwaffe losing the Battle of Britain, the Wilhelm Gustloff was moved to Gotenhafen, now Gdynia, Poland. There, it was moored permanently and repurposed as a floating barracks for Kriegsmarine U-boat cadets. The vessel was stripped of its hospital ship markings, repainted in camouflage, and outfitted with anti-aircraft guns on deck. It was now a legitimate military target under international maritime law. In 1941, the first submarine trainees arrived on board, greeted in person by Karl Dönitz, the commander of the Kriegsmarine, and affectionately known to sailors as Papa Karl for his protective attitude toward his men. The most mysterious phase of the ship's wartime service began when it hosted laboratories for Project 21, a top-secret initiative to develop a new generation of submarines, meant to serve as a wonder weapon alongside V-2 rockets, jet fighters, and Germany's atomic program. The Wilhelm Gustloff became one of the Reich's most important and heavily guarded assets. British naval intelligence learned of Project 21 by intercepting a telegram from Dönitz, and soon identified the ship's location. On September 30, 1943, the Royal Air Force launched a heavy air raid on Danzig and Gotenhafen, aiming to destroy the vessel. However, the anchored ship was only lightly damaged. The next day, Joseph Goebbels declared, "The Wilhelm Gustloff cannot be sunk. This ship symbol is a reflection of our Reich itself." Allied forces made several more failed attempts to destroy it from the air. Eventually, by late 1943, the laboratories and all documentation were secretly evacuated aboard submarines to an unknown location. This period revealed how swiftly a symbol of Nazi dreams had become a militarized installation of strategic value. But the war was closing in on East Prussia, and the Wilhelm Gustloff was soon to face a new mission: mass evacuation. By October 1944, the war had reached East Prussia. Soviet forces crossed into German territory and captured the town of Nemmersdorf, now Mayakovskoye, Kaliningrad Oblast. Though the Wehrmacht managed to temporarily retake the town, Nazi propaganda quickly capitalized on reports of looting and violence committed by Red Army troops. These accounts were inflated into a full-scale campaign portraying Soviet forces as barbaric. The result was widespread panic among civilians. Hundreds of thousands fled their homes, taking only what they could carry, heading west in search of safety. As East Prussia became increasingly isolated from the rest of Germany, refugees poured toward the Baltic coast, desperate to escape by sea. Thus began Operation Hannibal, the largest maritime evacuation in human history. Overseen personally by Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, the operation evacuated nearly 2 million people, soldiers, the wounded, and civilians, from East Prussia and Courland to the western parts of Germany. This took place under the constant threat of Soviet air superiority. Yet the Baltic fleet of the USSR, for reasons still debated, limited its engagement to a few submarines, refraining from active interference in the evacuation. This unexpected restraint gave the Germans a window of opportunity, but left ships like the Wilhelm Gustloff dangerously exposed. By January 1945, the ship had spent 4 years docked at Gotenhafen as a floating barracks. It was in poor condition. Its already underpowered engines required maintenance and could now manage only 12 knots, far below the original top speed of 15.5. A crew was hastily assembled, consisting of naval personnel and older reservists, but its size was insufficient to properly operate such a large vessel. Lifeboats, rafts, and vests were stocked only for the original capacity of 163 passengers, while the ship was soon to be filled with thousands of desperate refugees. Evacuation began on January 22, 1945. The first aboard were U-boat officers, their families, auxiliary naval personnel, and wounded soldiers. After that, civilians with special boarding passes, mostly women and children, were allowed to board. The ship filled quickly. People were packed into corridors, on decks, and even inside the former swimming pool, once a leisure area for cruise passengers. When passes ran out, the crew continued to take in more refugees. After leaving the pier, the Wilhelm Gustloff picked up an additional several hundred to over 1,000 people from small boats, unable to escape the harbor on their own. Modern estimates suggest that over 10,000 people were on board, along with 173 crew members. A ship once built for luxury and leisure had become a floating refuge in the chaos of war. The rushed preparations, poor mechanical condition, and lack of coordination set the stage for a coming disaster. Ahead lay a fatal voyage, one that would seal the Wilhelm Gustloff's place in history as the site of one of the deadliest maritime tragedies of all time. On January 30, 1945, the Wilhelm Gustloff set off on its final voyage from Gotenhafen. Departure was scheduled for noon, but chaos and overcrowding delayed the ship by nearly an hour and a half. The weather was brutal. Temperatures plummeted to 18 degrees. Strong winds battered the coastline, and snow squalls severely limited visibility. The Germans assumed that under such conditions, Soviet aircraft wouldn't attempt an attack, and Soviet submarines had never been spotted in the area. The ship departed with virtually no escort. A small torpedo boat turned back due to mechanical issues, and the only escort vessel, the Lova, a 397-ton former Norwegian minesweeper seized in 1940, was often lost from sight in the stormy seas. Confusion reigned on board. 4 captains were jointly in charge of navigation, further complicating the situation. The ship's formal commander was Friedrich Petersen, a retired naval officer. Alongside him on the bridge were 2 merchant marine captains advocating for caution, and Wilhelm Zahn, a confident and assertive U-boat division commander. Every decision sparked argument. The original plan was to sail at top speed using evasive anti-submarine maneuvers. But due to the poor condition of the engines and the threat of minefields, this plan was abandoned. Instead, they chose a direct route at a constant speed of 12 knots, dangerously slow for a large vessel sailing through a war zone. Then came a fatal decision. At 6 p.m., a message was received, transmitted in plain language, reporting that a group of German minesweepers was operating nearby. The message's authenticity was questionable, and the captains were divided. The military officers insisted on switching on the ship's running lights to avoid a potential collision. The civilian captains urged full blackout. In the end, the lights were turned on, making the ship a glowing target in the dark Baltic Sea. Meanwhile, Soviet submarine S-13, under the command of Captain 3rd Rank Alexander Marinesko, was patrolling the Bay of Danzig. Its presence there was almost accidental. The boat had been scheduled to depart earlier, but on New Year's Eve, Marinesco and several officers had deserted their post, spending time in the civilian sector. With no oversight, the crew also acted irresponsibly. Some snuck off to Finland to buy vodka, and others started a brawl. The entire crew faced possible court-martial, but there was no other available submarine or commander. Marinesco's superiors issued a stern reprimand and sent S-13 out on patrol on January 9, 1945, with the warning, "Redeem yourself with blood." By the evening of January 30th, S-13 had seen little success. Surfaced to recharge its batteries, the submarine rocked in the waves when suddenly bright lights appeared. The Wilhelm Gustloff. Marinesco had only 2 hours to plan. Staying on the surface, he maneuvered around the ship, positioned S-13 between the coast and the target, and prepared to strike. At 9:04 p.m., the first torpedo was fired from the bow, marked "For the Motherland." Then came "For the Soviet People" and "For Leningrad." A fourth torpedo, labeled "For Stalin," jammed in the tube and nearly exploded inside the sub, but was successfully disarmed. The torpedoes hit their mark. The first tore into the ship's bow. The second struck the area near the pool, where women from the Auxiliary Naval Unit had been quartered. The third hit the engine room. At that very moment, the passengers were listening to a radio broadcast of a speech by Hitler, muffled through ice-covered antennas. At 9:08 p.m., the speech cut off. Forever. Panic swept the decks. Passengers surged through narrow hallways, trampling children, slipping on icy stairs, or falling from the frozen decks. Some were crushed by collapsing lifeboats. Others froze to death in the black water. The ship listed sharply, preventing lifeboats from being lowered on the starboard side, while the davits on the port side were iced over, forcing people to cut them loose with pocket knives. One lifeboat, already filled with people, was crushed by a dislodged anti-aircraft gun. Rescue operations were launched by the Loa and the T-38, a torpedo boat that happened to be nearby. The heavy cruiser Admiral Hipper, carrying around 2,000 refugees, did not stop, fearing another attack. When rescue ships arrived an hour later, they found only bodies drifting in the sea. One lifeboat remained afloat. Inside was a single forgotten child. This voyage marked the beginning of the end for the Wilhelm Gustloff. On January 30th, 1945, the Wilhelm Gustloff was lost in what remains the deadliest maritime disaster of the 20th century. Estimates vary, but between 6,000 and 10,000 people perished. Modern German research places the number at 9,343, far surpassing the Titanic, which claimed a maximum of 1,635 lives. The Wilhelm Gustloff was packed with refugees, women, children, and the elderly fleeing the advance of the Red Army. The tragedy left a deep scar on history, igniting ongoing debates about its causes, morality, and the mysteries still surrounding the ship. Decades later, one question still lingers. Was the sinking of the Wilhelm Gustloff a war crime? The answer lies in context. S-13, under the command of Alexander Marinesco, was operating within a combat zone. The ship had long since lost its protected status as a hospital vessel. Gone were the Red Crosses of 1939. Instead, it was painted in camouflage, armed with anti-aircraft guns, and escorted by the Lova. All signs indicated it was a military target. Marinesco had no way of knowing that thousands of civilians were aboard. In the logic of war, the decision to attack was clear. Claims of a war crime hold no legal ground. The commander acted within the brutal reality of conflict. The sinking of the Wilhelm Gustloff was just one of S-13's victories. 2 weeks later, on February 13, 1945, the submarine sank the 14,660-ton General von Steuben, killing more than 4,000 people, again mostly refugees. These operations made S-13 the most successful submarine in the Soviet fleet. Marinesco was nominated for the title Hero of the Soviet Union, but received only the Order of the Red Banner. His later life ended in tragedy, but that is another story. The ship's destruction gave rise to countless myths and coincidences, some of them strangely mystical. One tale involves Third Reich astrologer Karl Ernst Kraft, who allegedly predicted the disaster back in 1937 based on the recurring numbers 30, 13, and 3. Strangely, they all came into play. The ship sank on January 30th, Wilhelm Gustloff's birthday. He would have turned 50. It was also the anniversary of Hitler's rise to power in 1933. The attack was led by S-13, commanded by a man born in 1913, and the submarine fired 3 torpedoes. The fourth, for Stalin, jammed and almost destroyed the sub. These coincidences became the seeds of the legend of the ship's curse. Another mystery concerns what may have been in the ship's cargo holds. The wreck site, marked on Polish naval maps as obstacle number 73, lies at a depth of only 45 meters, making it accessible to divers. Until 1955, Poland was prohibited from exploring the wreck. During that time, Soviet military divers were reportedly active at the site. Rumors swirled that the ship was transporting stolen treasures from occupied territories. Gold, artworks, possibly even the fabled Amber Room. East Prussia had its own troves, which may have been aboard during evacuation. By the time Polish divers were finally granted access, the wreck had already been compromised. The midsection had been cut open or blown apart. What the Soviet divers found remains classified. No records have been released. The witnesses remain silent. The sinking of the Wilhelm Gustloff stands as a symbol of wartime tragedy, where grand ideals and human lives are shattered by the relentless machinery of war. A ship built to represent the might of the Third Reich sank beneath the waves, taking thousands with it, and leaving behind questions that may never be fully answered.